Okay, 11th and 12th. We're going to continue on our lecture today, chapter 29, and we are starting with the next note, which is 52. We're talking about Vietnam and us getting out of Vietnam. It's already gone through multiple presidents. This is the fourth president. In April of 1970, Nixon is going to order all American troops into Cambodia to destroy communist bases there. People are going to look at this and say, see, he's actually escalating the war, but he's trying to leave South Vietnam with some way to defend themselves without being constantly bombarded with materials that are sent through Laos and Cambodia. Okay, the Vietnam War protesters accused the president of going back on his promise to get the troops out of Southeast Asia. There were angry and violent demonstrations on college campuses that led to the deaths of 4 students at Kent University in Ohio and at Jackson State College in Mississippi. I know for the one at Kent State, it was a matter of live ammunition being in the gun instead of rubber bullets. But it's violent protests are going to beget violent reactions. It's unfortunate. It's awful. It's horrendous, but it's, a fact of life. I mean, when you are putting yourself in a position of violence, there's going to be a violent response. Okay, there was a ceasefire in Vietnam declared in January of 1973. And part of that Vietnam Accord was that the POWs, the prisoners of war, would be free within 60 days. And there was also demand from the U.S. government that are missing in action, people that we didn't know whether or not they were POWs or killed. We wanted those names or those bodies to be returned to us, or those people being returned to us. And that was up to North and South Vietnam working together, but primarily North. Communists agreed to return all American prisoners of war. However, it was doubtful that all were returned. Many of them are considered MIAs or missing in action. They were never accounted for. And there were events or episodes where people who were considered to be killed in action were actually discovered later in POW camps. So it was really hard to decide whether or not all of this had actually been, everybody had been returned. And in fact, it became a huge part of American culture, especially in the 1980s, when people could take a step back from Vietnam and start looking at how our soldiers are actually treated, both by the people in Vietnam, especially North Vietnam, and the people in the United States. And this anger from a lot of veterans who put their lives on the line to free people that they didn't even know, and then were treated so abominably when they returned home. So that became the idea that we had men left behind because people were just so anxious to get out of, just so anxious to get us out of Vietnam. It was really hard for the veterans that went in. So that became really part of our culture. So TV shows like the A-Team were created about Vietnam vets who started working basically under or outside of the law because they were wanted men. They were falsely accused of crimes in Vietnam. Movies like Rambo or First Blood were all about Vietnam vets who go back to try to rescue those who were left behind. And then I know that Chuck Norris did it was called Missing in Action, actually. He did a variety of those, but they're pretty gory, but and I think there's some language, but yeah, there's quite a few movies made in the 80s based on this. Okay, the Vietnam Veterans Memorial commemorates all of the dead and missing soldiers by name. When this was first created, some people were really objecting to it, but the Vietnam vets loved it because it showed their concrete sacrifice there. Okay, without American support, South Vietnam actually fell very quickly to the communists. They quickly extended their control to Cambodia and Laos. The same plan that they using Cambodia and Laos to get materials to them when they were attacking South Vietnam. They turned around and attacked those countries as well. The communists that were already in Cambodia and Laos used that as an ally to take over their governments, to overthrow their governments. Now remember that according to communist thought, once a group of people is completely taken over, everything should be great. Everybody should be given lots to eat, great places to live. Everybody has a job. This is what they promise. It is not what they deliver. Okay, in Cambodia, communists sought to destroy families and private property. And you have to remember, this is one of the things they teach in communism is you take out the top tier of people, and then that wealth from the top tier is then redistributed to people of lower classes. In Cambodia, the top tier was taken out, but then you still had families who had private property. They also were considered part of that tier that needed to be taken out. So they were murdered so that their stuff could be redistributed. They ended up killing over 2.5 million men, women, and children, and they were murdered specifically for their property and their money, which went directly to the communists who were supposed to redistribute that wealth. This is the killing tree. This is the tree against which executioners beat children. When it says beat children, doesn't mean they were strapped to it and then whipped. It means that they were picked up by their feet and smashed into the tree until they died. These are not nice people. And this is communism. This is what communism looks like. And it is what it looks like every single time it is applied to a governmental system. But people are too stupid to figure it out after watching it happen over and over and over again. And then they start walking down the streets of the United States of America saying, yeah, we should try communism. We could do it right. These are the same people who are doing violent outbursts and riots in the streets of the US. They need to be stopped. So this is a rich peasant. Looks wealthy, yeah. He is rich only because he had a farm that he could farm, and he was shot for exploiting the peasantry, even though he himself is a peasant. This is what it looks like after all of the people have been killed. This is soil growing over bones. It's just been pushed into mounds. Each of those mounds is just a pile of bones. The communists didn't have enough money to pay for bullets to kill everybody, so they basically walled off areas, fenced off areas, and kept people in those areas and starved them to death. So those mass graves, there's 86 mass graves there with over 8,000 victims, almost 9,000. The 26th Amendment began to be talked about, specifically because the average age of the person who fought in Vietnam was 19 years old, and they weren't allowed to vote until they were 21. So the 26th Amendment lowered that voting age to 18 because they figured if you're old enough to fight for your country, you're old enough to have a say in its government. Henry Kissinger was the national security advisor under Nixon. He negotiated a ceasefire in Vietnam. He's actually going to do a lot of negotiation on behalf of Nixon, but strangely enough, even though he's going to be really Nixon's right-hand man in a lot of areas, a lot of conservatives who were very happy with Nixon, who were pro-Nixon, did not like Henry Kissinger at all. They thought he was a little snarky, a little smirky, a little sketchy. They didn't really trust him. It seemed like every time he was on the news, he was starting yet another attempt at peace, which isn't a bad thing. But when you are attempting to make peace at the expense of the benefit of the United States, it doesn't make much sense when you're representing the United States. Détente is a French word. It means to relax tensions. And this is one of the things that he was really pushing for, was that we would relax our tensions between us and Russia. That's what this is about. The problem is we had tried multiple times to relax tensions with Russia. We had multiple times where we wanted to sit down at a table with Russia and talk about limiting nuclear devices, limiting missiles. And every time we'd sign the contract and we'd sign the treaty, and then Russia would go ahead and do what they wanted to anyway. So it didn't make much sense that we were constantly trying for detente between us and Russia when Russia wouldn't play by anybody else's rules. 1972, Nixon and Kissinger agreed to the Strategic Arms Limitation Talks. This was a treaty with the Soviet leader Leonid Brezhnev. Under the treaty, both countries agreed to limit production of nuclear arms, and guess what? The USSR did not keep the treaty. Maybe this time it'll work. In February of 1972, President Nixon visited communist China and set the stage for future relations, trade, and military planning with that nation. But when he did that, he basically turned his back on another country that called itself China, which is now called Taiwan. That was established, Taiwan was established by people who were nationalist Chinese. They were not communists. They saw themselves as being the true Chinese people, and China itself had been taken over by a communist dictator, which they had been. And so when Nixon went to communist China and started setting up future relations, trade, and military planning with that nation, it was seen as a betrayal to the people of Taiwan. Conservatives in the United States could not understand why he was reaching out to communist China and trying to establish detente with communist Russia. It didn't make sense for an American president to be trying so hard to establish relationships with communist countries, especially a president that was a Republican and was supposed to be conservative, but obviously he wasn't as conservative as a lot of Republicans considered him to be. To please China, the United States abandoned the Free Chinese of Taiwan. This is what Taiwan looks like today. It is a beautiful country, beautiful culture, very well built. I mean, it's remarkable and incredibly wealthy. Communist China doesn't hold a candle to it, even though it holds a lot more property and has a lot more people. In June of 1967, Egypt, Jordan, and Syria all attacked Israel at the same time. Israel won a strong victory. They fought off all of those attackers, and that was called the Six-Day War. They captured the Sinai Peninsula and the west bank of the Jordan River and the Golan Heights. The Arabs turned to the Soviet Union. They wanted more arms, and the United States responded by sending more weapons to Israel. Then on October 6, 1973, Egypt, Syria, and Jordan again attacked Israel, this time again with Soviet weapons. And the Arabs showed contempt for the Jews by attacking on one of the most holy Jewish days. Let's try that again. Most holy days in the Jewish calendar, the day of Yom Kippur, which is a day of fasting, reflection, and then feasting together with friends and family at the end. It's a day when you're supposed to be purifying yourself from the sins of the past year and spending that time in prayer before a holy God. So they were attacked on Yom Kippur. The prime minister at the time was Golda Meir. You can see her. She is in the top picture. She's got a purse on her lap. That's how you can tell who she is. But the Arab nations really did expect her to be weak because she was a female. And they also expected her, because she was considered a mother in Israel, that she would object to fighting on this holy day. They thought they were going to be able to walk in and just kick everybody's butts, but she turned it right around on them and said, no, God will understand. Okay, you're not taking us over. In the Yom Kippur War, the Israelis drove the Egyptians back and prepared to invade Egypt. They weren't just going to push them into their borders anymore. They were going to invade the borders and settle this once and for all. But of course, they were stopped from doing that. This is a pontoon bridge, by the way, over the Sinai, or no, over the Red Sea. Secretary of State Henry Kissinger, there he is again, he arranged for a truce. So the UN sent forces to patrol the borders between Egypt and Israel. You have to remember, though, Israel was getting ready to cross Egypt's border and settle things once and for all, but Egypt and its other nations that were fighting as allies with Egypt were consistently invading the borders of Israel. Okay, OPEC is the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries. This organization was a monopoly, and the whole purpose of the monopoly was to control the supply and price of oil. So they would all get together, they would decide how much oil cost, and that's how much they would sell it for around the world. So if your country did something they didn't like, they could raise the price of the oil they sold to you. In 1973, because the United States rushed to Israel's defense against the Arab aggressors in the Yom Kippur War, OPEC cut off all oil exports to the United States, which shouldn't be a big deal because we actually have quite a lot of oil. The problem was we had a lot of presidents who had decided it was easier for us to get our oil from foreign nations and have it brought over and refined and then use that rather than exploiting our own oil fields. So as a result, we were stuck with a gas shortage. We had an oil and gas shortage in the 70s. People went to the gas station based on the numbers on their license plate. You know, if your license plate starts or ends with this number, you can come in on these days, or else they would have flags out. For those of you who remember Mrs. Raymond, when she was in high school, it was her job in the family to drive everybody's car one by one to the gas station on the proper days and fill their cars with gas because people stayed in line for hours at a time waiting to get gas. Okay, let's go on. This Arab oil embargo sent American economy into a very serious recession that it didn't need to be in the first place because we have plenty of oil reserves. But OPEC had raised the price of oil from $2 a barrel to $11 a barrel. That is a crazy jump in price. The Trans-Alaska Pipeline was then put into effect. Congress permitted several large oil companies to work together to build an 800-mile-long pipeline in 1974, extended from the North Slope to the southern shore of Alaska, where it could then be put into a ship and then taken down the coast of the United States. Okay, America's 1970s recession was a result specifically of the oil embargo, the government spending on the Vietnam War, and welfare programs. Those three things together created a huge recession. President Nixon tried to control inflation by freezing wages and prices. This is when government gets involved in how much money a person is allowed to make or charge for their services. At this point, the president is not acting in a conservative manner. This is the opposite of what conservatives do. We don't like to fool around with the inflation by freezing prices or raising prices or wages. He wanted to do that for a 90-day period, thinking that when the controls were lifted, the inflation would dissipate. Instead, the inflation just continued. The effort to end segregation continued into the 70s, if you can believe that. One controversial way to end segregation in schools involved court-ordered busing of students from one school district to another. On paper, it sounds like it would be a good idea. You have a lot of kids in this school who are Black. Let's send some of them to the school that's primarily white, and we'll bus them there. And it's really just, at this point, it doesn't make any sense. This wasn't because these kids really wanted to go to a school that was close to them, because they weren't. Both schools were actually integrated by that time. But just in the minds of some people in government, there weren't enough Black people in this school, so they would bus them to the other school. The problem with that is there were a lot of kids who were on the top of their game while they were in the school in their neighborhood who ended up having to be bused to other schools whose grades took a dramatic dive because they were on a bus for so long. They had to be bused out. There were some cases as long as spending an hour on the bus to school and then an hour on the way back, which meant no after-school programs for them, no after-school jobs for them, because they were always on the bus, always exhausted, and always having a problem getting all the homework done. So this was actually more controversial for the fact that it wasn't beneficial to the Black community as much as it should have been. It seemed like it would be beneficial on paper, but talking to the kids who actually went through it, it was not beneficial to them at all. Supreme Court also made several liberal decisions in the early 1970s. They ruled against capital punishment in 1972, which is when a person who is guilty of murder, and there are witnesses to that murder, generally speaking, they have been convicted of planning out the murder and carrying it out. That makes it a capital punishment case. They ruled against capital punishment, meaning there's no death penalty anymore, in 1972. But they ruled in favor of abortion, where an innocent child is actually killed because it's not the right time for its mom. The mom doesn't think this is a good time in her life to have that baby. Now, you will often hear, because this is the argument that is always made, well, what about in cases of rape or incest? First of all, those are extremely, extremely low numbers, like barely over 1%. But also, you have to keep in mind that just because a woman has gone through a horrific crime that was committed against her doesn't mean that the innocent child should be punished. Just that's not the way this works. Roe versus Wade legalized abortion, killing off the babies before birth. That's what abortion is. Norma McCovey, former Jane Roe of Roe versus Wade, she was persuaded by feminist attorneys to lie and say that she was raped, that she needed abortion. It was all a lie. Now, just in the last couple of days, they have been coming out and saying, well, you know, at the very end of her life, she said that she was saved, and that was a lie. She was actually being paid to say that she was saved, and she was anti-abortion. But the truth was, Norma McCovey never had an abortion, ever. Her daughter that she gave birth to was adopted out, so she never had an abortion, and she was really just the face of the abortion industry. It had nothing to do with her personally. So, okay, that was it. But yeah, she did say that she was raped. She did. And she did go to the doctor and say that she wanted an abortion. And the doctor said, no, I can't give you an abortion. It's illegal. And that's why she went to court. And she was taken to court by abortion attorneys, by feminist attorneys who wanted abortion to be made legal. Okay, Senator George McGovern ran against Nixon in 1972. He did not have a popular, a good time as he ran. He was not a popular candidate at all. In fact, there was a novelty song written about him called "Gotta Find a Running Mate," because nobody wanted to run with him as a VP because nobody liked him. Nixon ended up winning by the largest margin ever, even though people were not completely sold on him. There were people who were glad he was getting us out of Vietnam, but they thought that he was actually prolonging our stay in Vietnam. There were people who were on the conservative side who were very upset by the fact that he was reaching out to communist countries, but, you know, also looking at, well, maybe we just need to move forward. But he ended up winning by the largest margin ever. However, after he won, it was discovered that while he was campaigning for his reelection, he had hired people to break into the Democratic National headquarters to see if the Democratic Party was going broke, to see how close they were to bankruptcy. You don't need to do that kind of stuff. So shortly after his reelection, Nixon began to face problems with his administration. First of all, Spiro Agnew, his vice president, resigned because he got caught not paying his taxes. You have to pay your taxes. That's just the way it is. He also admitted to taking bribes. You can't do that when you're in public service. So he ends up resigning. So the president then has to choose a new vice president. And he's going to do that by looking at the people who are in the Senate. He's going to talk to the Republican Party because he's the head of the Republican Party. The president is the head of whatever party put them in office. And they're going to match him up with a senator named Gerald Ford. Gerald Ford did not like Richard Nixon. Couldn't stand him. A lot of Republicans in government did not like Nixon. But the Republican Party basically told Ford, we need you to be in there to help us out. Because, I mean, this guy is kind of going off the rails a little bit. So we need somebody steady who will be, you know, a good vice president. So he was suggested to Nixon. Nixon, who really didn't have any contact with Ford before this, not really, said, okay, I'm going to choose Ford. The Senate approved it. Ford became the next vice president. While all that's going on, Star Wars is released. Yay! I don't really care for the movie. And that's okay. We all have things that we really, really love and things that, you know, other people love and we hate their things. And you know, that's okay. We're allowed to have different opinions and stuff. However, with everything we've been learning about the 1970s and pantheism especially, if you want to really get a good, clear concept of what's going on in the 70s, watch Star Wars, because it's like a map for pantheism in the 1970s. So, yeah, give it a shot. I don't have to watch it with you, so I'm fine. Okay. By the summer of 1974, several President Nixon's closest advisors had been convicted of criminal charges involving the illegal break-in of the Democratic National Headquarters. This happened at the Watergate building. Watergate is actually this resort complex, and it has a hotel, it has office buildings, it has some golf courses, pools, everything. It's very nice. Okay, but the Democratic National Headquarters was in the Watergate office building, and all of this, the break-in happened 2 years before during Nixon's campaign for re-election. The Watergate affair became big news, still is big news. People know exactly what you're talking about. You talk about Watergate. The break-in in the Watergate building. Nixon claimed he did not know about the break-in, but it turns out he did know about the break-in and actually hired the guys to go break in, who weren't really professional crooks. They were people who worked for Nixon. They were his, like, gophers. They were people who worked for him. They did jobs for him. It was discovered he not only had knowledge of the break-in, but was part of the cover-up as well. You see, Nixon was a little bit on the paranoid side, and so he'd had a tape recorder installed into his desk in the Oval Office during his first term as president. Very few people knew about it. When he was talking to these men about the break-in, somebody later on, when they got caught, said, well, why don't you just listen to the tape? that'll tell everybody exactly who was doing what. And people were like, what tape? And that's when this news came out. So the Congress said to Nixon, you need to turn over that tape. And he's like, no, I don't. They said, yes, you do. We have a subpoena. You have to turn that over. That's evidence in a crime. No, I'm not going to turn it in. Eventually, he did have to turn it in. And they discovered that about 18 minutes of that tape had been erased. It doesn't look good. So Richard Nixon was on the short track for impeachment at that point. The Congress was getting ready to impeach him in the House and in the Senate. And so he wanted to avoid impeachment because he knew that if he was impeached and left the presidency, he was impeached having committed a crime, then when his time as president was over, he could then be arrested for the crime and tried after he left office. So he wanted to avoid impeachment and possible conviction, so he resigned on August 9th, 1974. This is the very first time a president resigned from office. So Gerald Ford became president upon Nixon's resignation. Now the Republican Party told him, okay, this is what you need to do. You need to immediately pardon Nixon, because if you don't, this whole Watergate affair is going to be the only thing people remember about your presidency. You won't be able to get a thing done because everybody's going to be focused on Nixon and his being arrested and going to court on this Watergate affair. You need to just pardon him. To pardon someone means that you've made it so they can never, ever be arrested or convicted for the crime that they've committed. So he pardoned Nixon based on the suggestion by the Republican Party. So he pardoned him for any offenses he might have committed. At that point, the Republican Party lost all respect in the eyes of the nation. Even people who were diehard Republicans said, what in the world did you just do? That was stupid. You just backed up a guy who obviously committed a crime. It's like you covered for him. What are you doing? Well, Ford didn't like Nixon. He thought he was a jerk. But when he said, I'm going to give you a full pardon, people were like, oh, you guys must be best buds or something. It's not true, but no, it didn't work out. As a result, the Democrats had more fuel as to why there shouldn't be a Republican president, and Republicans were pretty angry about the fact that this crime had been covered up. Now, Ford was also trying to deal with this recession that he was in the middle of. So he wanted to cut back on government spending and social welfare, but Congress refused to cooperate. Why would they listen to a guy who just pardoned a criminal? They don't care. At this point, he is what we call a lame duck. Okay, it's a little different in the United States. We call a lame duck someone who's in politics but doesn't have any real political power. Usually it's because it's a president who's in the second term of office and there's not enough people there to support him when he tries to pass his laws or anything. Or a president, not necessarily in second term, but a president who has served his second term and a new president has been elected and they're just finishing their term. They don't really have any real power. So that's what a lame duck is in the US. In England, it's more of a term that's used for financial officers in the stock market. Okay. But Ford wanted to cut back on government spending and social welfare. Congress is going to refuse to cooperate, and the economy suffered as a result. Because every time you have more and more government spending, more and more social welfare, the economy suffers every time. Because again, welfare is being paid for by tax money that's being taken from working people and then redistributed throughout the nation. Okay. In 1975, communists took over all of South Vietnam. So we're now in our fifth president with Vietnam. But the South Vietnamese, they tried to hold off the North Vietnamese for a while. They didn't really succeed. And in 1975, communists took over all of the lower part of the peninsula. People were trying desperately to get into the American embassy, hoping that they would be able to escape from communist rule. They did not want to be communists in South Vietnam. They were terrified of communism in South Vietnam because they knew what it was about. So here are people lining up to get into helicopters. It got really sketchy here, guys. Not everybody's going to get in the helicopter. It got so bad that people from South Vietnam actually put together rafts and tried to float over to the United States. That's how bad it got. There was a terrible bloodbath of communist-inspired murder and torture that followed in the neighboring nation of Cambodia. Communists also took over control of Laos. "130,000 Vietnamese managed to escape communism by fleeing in boats to the United States." And I remember TV commercials asking for American citizens to take in Vietnamese refugees, especially kids whose parents basically shoved them on the boat and said, "Good luck. Hope you have a really good life, but we don't want you to stay here. Your life will be miserable." So they ship their kids out by themselves sometimes. The face of American towns began to change during the 70s. Chain stores and franchise businesses multiplied across the country. A chain store means that there are multiple copies of that store located in, a variety of areas. And then the idea of the franchise means that the company, like for instance, Sam Goody, which is a record and tape music store, the major company sold out franchises. If I wanted to, I could own a Sam Goody, just one of their little franchises. I'd have to pay a certain amount. They would give me all of the signage and the floor plans. I would have to follow their basic rules, but I could make that thing work as well or as bad as I wanted to. It was up to me as a free enterprise person. But, as a franchise holder, that means I would have to follow some of their rules for good sales. And of course, the McDonald's was always a big thing, but that was really one of the first chain restaurants. Okay. And in the 70s, you can ask your grandparents about this. Everybody knew the jingle for McDonald's. It was all the ingredients on a Big Mac. Not kidding. That was the commercial jingle. It's 2 all beef patties, special sauces, cheese, pickles, onions, and a sesame bun. Because when you were a kid in the 70s, you had to know this or you were stupid. Okay? Your teachers didn't tell you that. Your friends did. So we rehearsed it. We said it. We said it as fast as we could. We know it. And at 53, I still remember something I memorized when I was like 7. Okay, franchise. This is a permit to market a product or provide a service in a given area. You can get a franchise for Pizza Hut, McDonald's, Jack in the Box. When people talk about we need to support, local businesses, local, restaurants, guess what? Pizza Hut, Jack in the Box, and McDonald's are also local restaurants because those franchises are owned by people locally. So don't get it twisted, people. Chain stores such as Kmart and later Walmart became common. Kmart was huge in the 70s and into the 80s. The Walmart explosion didn't happen until like late 80s, early 90s. That's when it really took off. This was the original Walton's, by the way. Walmart started out as Walton's. It was a 5 and dime. That means there was a variety store. Sam Walton, the creator of Walmart, started with one small store in Arkansas, and as the store prospered, he opened others until Walton became one of the wealthiest men in the world. And he said, "It was a real blessing for me to be so green." In other words, it was a blessing for me to be new or inexperienced. Okay? Green and ignorant, because it was from that experience that I learned a lesson which has stuck with me through all the years. You can learn from everybody. That's one of the big things for people who own like chain stores. Mr. S. the Elder used to work for Cornette, which you've never heard of because it doesn't exist anymore. And one of the reasons was the guy who owned Cornette would not listen to people They would tell him, this thing isn't selling. He's like, well, it's too bad. I got a whole bunch of them in the warehouse. You're going to sell them anyway. It's like, but you can't force somebody to buy something. He had somebody working in his warehouse who also didn't seem to understand distribution or how the market works, because the market works where you have a supply and demand. Okay. And this guy would be like, you can't have anything that people want until you get rid of all the stuff that they didn't want before. And it used to drive Mr. S crazy when he was a manager at Cornett. Okay, McDonald's was one of the first fast food chains. Oops, sorry. And then the Sun Belt states became a thing. Yeah, they did. Why? Because of the fuel crisis is one of the big reasons. People couldn't afford heat in the Midwest. The Midwest and the upper parts of the US. So they started doing this thing, especially older people. They didn't want to spend all their money on like heating fuel during the winter time. So they started doing traveling during the winter instead of in the summer, like a lot of people do. They have their time off in the summer, and they called themselves snowbirds. So they would migrate like they were birds from the north part of the country down to the southern part. I grew up in Arizona, which is right next to California. If you look on that map, it's like at the very bottom of California there. And our population in our city doubled every winter because of snowbirds. People would come down for the warmth. And so we call this area, the southern part of the United States, the Sun Belt area. And people really were more winter, wow, just call them winter birds, traveling to the southern part and then going back up and living in the northern part during the summer. But a lot of people started moving just exclusively down to the southern part into the Sun Belt to retire because it was a little bit cheaper to live there too. In 1976, it was the bicentennial, and that was the highlight of the 70s. It was Spirit of 76, bicentennial, red, white, and blue everywhere. This was the 200th birthday of the United States of America. So I have a picture from Disneyland during the bicentennial. This Spirit of 76 vibe at the top, that was exactly the kind of stuff you saw everywhere. And then at the bottom, on the right-hand side, that's called the Freedom Train. And it was really cool. It was a moving museum. It traveled all around the United States so that kids from public schools in like every city really that had train tracks could go and look at Americana, American memorabilia from history and just walk through the train and see this museum. And then you come out the other end and they're like, okay, every school in this city got a chance to see everything. See you guys later. And they'd go on to the next city. It was really cool. So I got to go on it. I was too young to really understand a lot of it though. Okay, Jimmy Carter. He was a farmer and a former governor, but he had no real ties to Washington. That's how they sold him to the American people. The Democrats were all about, we can't trust the Republicans. Look at them. And, they're just committing crimes and covering up for each other. And so the Democrats chose a man who really didn't have a lot of ties in Washington, D.C. He was politically savvy. He was the governor of Georgia, but he was promoted more as a peanut farmer because that's what he grew. He really was the first man from the Deep South, however, to win the presidency since Zachary Taylor. But other than people in Georgia, people really didn't know who Jimmy Carter was until he started running for president. In 1977, though, he ran against Ford. Ford, no way he was getting elected after, after pardoning Nixon. It wasn't going to happen. In 1977, President Carter followed the desire of the United Nations, and he negotiated the surrender of the Panama Canal Zone. And everybody in the United States went, that was idiotic. Why would you do that, you idiot? Okay. He lost a lot of support there. First of all, the United Nations had absolutely nothing to do with the Panama Canal. Panama Canal was created way before the United Nations were. When the United States purchased the land for the Panama Canal, they had the full permission of the Panamanian government. The United States had helped Panama become an independent nation. That was part of the deal. We will help you become an independent nation. We will pay for this piece of property. Will you allow us to buy it from you? They said yes. We not only dug the canal, we eradicated disease from around the canal with yellow fever and malaria specifically. And then we were in charge of maintaining the canal and guarding the canal. So that was all money out of the United States pocket, but we made money back by running the canal. Now, the United Nations is saying, you know what, Panama really wants their canal back. It wasn't theirs. It was located within their country, but the land and the canal did not belong to Panama. It could not be returned to them because it wasn't theirs in the first place. So we use the term surrender. We surrendered the Panama Canal because of Jimmy Carter. It was his way of trying to make nice with the people of Panama. In reality, the leader of Panama at the time was not the nicest person. So this is going to give communists around the world the idea that the United States had given up on its policy of protecting Central America from communism. Look at that. They put just a little bit of pressure on the president and he just gave up the Panama Canal. Let's take it. Let's go into Central America and we will make it a communist paradise. Oh, the old lie coming back around again. Okay, I'm going to stop right here. I'm hoping we can finish this up really quickly. Possibly tomorrow we'll finish this chapter and go on to the next chapter. I am doing my dead level best to get us through. I won't be doing a lecture on Monday because it's a day off for everybody, but I definitely will Tuesday and Wednesday until we're done with this book. I want to make that really clear because I did have, somebody say, well, you said you weren't doing any more lectures. And I'm like, I never said that at all. Okay. So I just wanted to let you know, I'm still here. I'm still going to finish the book. Even, if it takes me a lot of extra hours, I'm going to do it. I really want you guys to have the opportunity. But in the meantime, you guys get your homework done and I will talk to you tomorrow. Bye.